Sometime in the winter of 1935, in a modest house in the German city of Wuppertal, a 6-year-old girl named Gerhard Domagk was dying. She had pricked herself with an unsterilized needle. The wound had become infected. Streptococcal bacteria, the kind that killed thousands of children across Europe every year, were spreading through her small body. Her fever was climbing. The doctors who examined her had no remedy. In 1935, there was no remedy. A scratch from a thorn could kill a grown man if it became infected. A cut from a kitchen knife could end a child's life. Pneumonia, scarlet fever, childbed fever, blood poisoning, all of them were essentially untreatable. Hospitals could clean wounds and set bones, but once bacteria entered the bloodstream, there was nothing medicine could do except wait. Except that Hildegard's father was not an ordinary man. Her father was Gerhard Domagk, the director of experimental pathology at the Bayer laboratories of IG Farben in Elberfeld. And for the past 3 years, in a laboratory a few miles from his home, he had been quietly testing a red dye compound on infected mice. The compound was called Prontosil. It was still experimental, still barely understood, and had been tested on only a handful of human patients. But Domagk's daughter was dying, and so he gave it to her. Hildegard survived. Her skin turned a permanent reddish hue from the dye, a discoloration she would carry for the rest of her life. But she lived. And her survival was, in that moment, the most important medical event in the world, because the drug that saved her was the first substance ever proven to cure a bacterial infection inside a living human body. Nothing like it had ever existed. The drug that saved her would eventually be recognized as one of the most important medical discoveries of the 20th century. It would earn Domagk the 1939 Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine. It would open the door to the entire age of antibiotics. And here is the part of this story that should stop you where you are sitting. A decade after Domagk saved his daughter's life with a drug born in a German laboratory, American infantry sergeants would carry that same drug in their front trouser pockets on the beaches of Normandy, in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, and across every battlefield of the Second World War. They would sprinkle it into open wounds with their own hands. They would dose their wounded friends with tablets from packets they carried on their own cartridge belts. They had no medical degrees. They had no special training beyond what every American soldier received in basic. And when German officers captured those Americans and examined their kit, they could not understand what they were looking at. Not because the drug was unfamiliar. Germany had invented the drug. They could not understand why a rifleman was carrying it. That question, why an ordinary American soldier was trusted with medicine that the German army reserved for trained medical personnel, is the question this entire investigation turns on. Because the answer is not about a pill, it is not about a powder. It is about 2 armies that looked at the same drug, the same science, the same problem of men bleeding to death on battlefields, and arrived at completely opposite conclusions about who should be allowed to do something about it. To understand how that happened, we have to go back to the laboratory where the drug was born. We have to follow it from a German scientist's desperate act to save his daughter, through a French laboratory that cracked it open, into an American factory system that produced it by the millions of pounds, and finally into the pocket of a 20-year-old rifleman from Ohio or New Jersey or Georgia who had never heard of Gerhard Domagk and did not care. He only knew that the packet said to sprinkle the powder into the wound and swallow the tablets with water, and that is what he did. This is the story of how a German miracle drug became an American battlefield revolution, not because of what it cured, but because of who was allowed to use it. Gerhard Domagk was born in 1895 in a small town in Brandenburg, in what was then the German Empire. He served as a medic in the First World War on the Eastern Front, where he watched young soldiers die of infected wounds that no doctor could treat and no drug could stop. A scratch from a bayonet. A splinter from a shell casing. Wounds that should have been trivial became death sentences once infection set in. That experience shaped the rest of his life. After the war, he studied medicine and pathology, and in 1927 he was recruited by IG Farben to direct experimental pathology and bacteriology at the Bayer laboratories in Elberfeld, near Wuppertal. His assignment was to test chemical compounds for potential use as drugs. The idea driving the research was not new. Paul Ehrlich, the German physician who had won the 1908 Nobel Prize, had theorized decades earlier that certain chemical dyes might selectively poison microorganisms without harming the patient. Ehrlich called the concept a magic bullet. Domagk set out to find one. He worked with two chemists at Bayer, Fritz Miech and Joseph Clara, who were synthesizing new azo dyes, a family of chemical compounds used primarily in the textile industry. Domagk tested these dyes on mice infected with lethal doses of streptococcal bacteria. In 1932, he found one that worked. It was a red azo dye that contained a sulfonamide group. He gave it the laboratory designation KL730. It would later be marketed under the name Prontosil. In his first experiment, 12 infected mice that received Prontosil survived. The 12 that did not receive it died. It took 3 more years of rigorous testing before Domagk published his results. When he did, in 1935, the medical world changed. But the real breakthrough did not come from Germany. It came from France. At the Pasteur Institute in Paris, a team led by Ernest Fourneau, working alongside the husband and wife chemists Jacques and Thérèse Trefuel, along with Daniel Beauvais and Federico Nitti, took Prontosil apart molecule by molecule. What they found changed everything. Prontosil was a prodrug. Inside the human body, it broke down into 2 components. One was triaminobenzene, which produced the red color and had no medical value at all. The other was a smaller, colorless compound called sulfanilamide, and sulfanilamide was the part that killed bacteria. The red dye was just a carrier. The actual weapon had been hiding inside it all along. This mattered enormously for one reason that would reshape the global pharmaceutical industry overnight. Sulfanilamide was not new. Bayer's own chemists had actually obtained a German patent on sulfanilamide as far back as 1909, as part of their dye research, without ever realizing what it could do medically. By 1935, the original patent had long expired. The compound was in the public domain. It could not be patented again by anyone, anywhere. This meant that no company, no country, no government on earth could control it. The moment the French team published their findings in November of 1935, sulfanilamide belonged to the world. Anyone with a chemistry laboratory and a manufacturing plant could produce it. And they did. Within months, pharmaceutical companies in Britain, France, and the United States were manufacturing their own versions. The floodgates opened. By 1937, American production of sulfur drugs had reached 350,000 pounds. By 1942, driven by wartime demand and the full mobilization of American industrial capacity, that number had exploded to more than 14 million pounds. Dozens of American manufacturers were producing sulfur compounds, including Lederle, Upjohn, Park Davis, and Heinsohn Westcott and Dunning. The United States had taken a German discovery, cracked open by a French laboratory, and turned it into an American industrial product on a scale that the German pharmaceutical industry could not begin to match. The irony runs deeper than production numbers. In 1939, the Nobel Committee awarded Domagk the prize in physiology or medicine for his discovery of the antibacterial effects of Prontosil. The Nazi government was furious. 2 years earlier, the committee had given the Nobel Peace Prize to Karl von Ossietzky, a German pacifist and outspoken critic of the regime who had been imprisoned in a concentration camp. Adolf Hitler had taken it as a personal insult to the German state. He issued a decree forbidding any German citizen from accepting a Nobel Prize. When Domagk's award was announced, Domagk was forced to decline. He was briefly arrested by the Gestapo and compelled to write a letter to the committee, expressing his gratitude, but explaining that he could not accept the honor. He did not receive his diploma and medal until 1947, 2 years after the war ended, and 8 years after the prize had been awarded. The man who had unlocked the most important drug of the decade was forbidden by his own government from being recognized for it. And within a few years, that same government would send millions of soldiers into battle without putting the drug he discovered into their pockets, while the army of a country that had not invented it would put it into the pocket of every single man who wore a uniform. The American military's decision to adopt sulfur drugs began in 1939, when the Army Medical Department launched an intensive research program in coordination with Johns Hopkins University and the Medical Field Service School. The results convinced the War Department that sulfanilamide could prevent wound infections in the field, the kind of infections that had killed hundreds of thousands of soldiers in the First World War. In that earlier conflict, A bullet wound to the leg was not necessarily fatal from the bullet itself. It was fatal from the gangrene, the blood poisoning, and the wound infections that followed. Wound infection was one of the greatest killers of injured soldiers in the First World War, and for many men the wound itself was survivable, but the infection that followed was not. Sulfa offered the first realistic chance of changing that equation. The army moved fast. By the fall of 1941, before the United States had even entered the war, crystalline sulfanilamide powder was being packed into the standard-issue first aid packet carried by every American soldier. The packet was called the Carlisle Bandage, named after Carlisle Barracks in Pennsylvania, where it had originally been designed in the 1920s. The improved version, the First Aid Packet United States Government Carlisle model, appeared in the summer of 1940. About 8 million of these packets were required for the 1940 Army expansion alone. It was a simple, elegant piece of engineering designed for one purpose: to be used by a man under fire with one hand. A wax-coated cardboard or pressed metal container, small enough to fit in a trouser pocket, sealed airtight to keep the sterile gauze compress inside clean and dry. Tear tape let a man rip it open with one hand, while his other hand pressed against a wound or held a weapon. Markings on the dressing read, "Red color indicates back of dressing, put other side next to wound." Tucked inside, alongside the gauze, was a small envelope containing 5 grams of crystalline sulfanilamide powder with a shaker top. Manufacturers of the Carlisle packet included Bauer and Black, along with several other medical supply companies. The shaker envelopes were made by Heinsohn, Westcott, and Dunning. In early 1942, the Army added a second component, a separate sealed packet containing wound tablets, initially 12 sulfanilamide tablets of half a gram each, later changed to 8 sulfadiazine tablets of the same weight. The tablets were produced by Lederle, Upjohn, and the Anacin Manufacturing Company. These tablets were carried in the web pouch on the soldier's cartridge belt, separate from the metal Carlisle packet, so that a man had 2 independent sources of medication on his body at all times. The critical point is not what was inside the packet. The critical point is who was expected to use it. On April 7, 1943, the War Department published Field Manual 2111, titled Basic Field Manual First Aid for Soldiers. It was signed for the Chief of Staff by George C. Marshall himself. The manual's stated purpose was, and these are its own words paraphrased from the original text, to teach the soldier what he can do for himself or a fellow soldier if injury or sickness occurs when no medical officer or medical department soldier is nearby. Read that sentence again. It is addressed to the soldier, not to the medic, not to the doctor, to the man with the rifle. The manual included illustrated instructions showing a soldier, not a medic, sprinkling sulfanilamide powder from the shaker envelope directly into an open wound on a forearm. It told the soldier to then apply the sterile dressing from his own packet. For wounds other than to the abdomen or throat, it told the soldier to swallow his sulfadiazine tablets with a large amount of water. For abdominal wounds, it told him to sprinkle the powder over the wound and exposed organs, but to take nothing by mouth, because sulfur caused nausea and cramps that could worsen an abdominal injury. Every American who went through basic training in the war years received instruction in these procedures. Every one of them practiced tearing open the Carlisle packet and applying the dressing. Every one of them was told, in plain language, that he was responsible for his own first aid, and for the first aid of the man next to him. The United States Army had taken a drug discovered by a German scientist, manufactured it on an industrial scale no other country could match, and then done something that no European army had considered doing. It had put that drug into the hands of every single soldier and told him to use it on himself. Every like on this video is a small thing, but it helps this investigation reach the people who want the history told accurately, with the names, the facts, and the details that actually matter. That means more than I can say. To understand why the German army did not do the same thing, you have to understand how the Wehrmacht organized its medical care. And the answer reveals something about the German military mind that goes far deeper than pills and bandages. The German system was built around evacuation and specialization. It was a system designed by professionals for professionals, and it worked exactly as designed. A wounded German soldier's journey from the front line to treatment followed a rigid chain of echelons, each one staffed by progressively more qualified medical personnel. The first stop was the Verwundertennest, the nest of the wounded, located roughly 20 to 25 meters from the point of contact. Here, a trained medical non-commissioned officer, a Sanitätsunteroffizier, provided first aid. This man had been trained for approximately 6 months at a military medical school and had completed specialized field courses. He applied pressure bandages, splinted fractures, and stopped bleeding. He was roughly equivalent in function and position to an American company aid man. Supporting him were approximately 4 Krankentrager, stretcher bearers, per company, each equipped with 2 medic pouches and a sidearm. There were also about 8 Hilfskrankentrager, auxiliary stretcher bearers, who were ordinary combat soldiers given additional first aid training, who could drop their weapons and don a Red Cross armband when casualties needed to be carried to the rear. The second echelon was the Truppenverbandplatz, the troop dressing station, corresponding roughly to an American battalion aid station. This was where the first medical officer appeared, typically a doctor with the rank of Assistenzarzt or Oberarzt, and this is the fact that matters most for this investigation. According to the 1945 5th United States Army Surgeon's Report, which directly compared the American and German medical systems after months of observation in the field, it was at this echelon, under the supervision of a medical officer, that infection prevention was performed. The report documents that sulfa drugs were administered at the Truppenverbandplatz. Sulfapyridine was given by mouth. Sulfanilamide powder was insufflated, meaning blown or sprinkled, into wounds at the time of the first dressing. Tetanus and gas gangrene antitoxin were also given here. The third echelon was the Hauptverbandplatz, the main dressing station, located roughly 4 miles behind the front, staffed by the division's Sanitätskompanie, the medical company. This was where surgery happened. Amputations, transfusions, and primary wound closure were performed here by surgeons who had years of training. The German system was thorough, professional, and in many respects excellent. What it was not was decentralized. The individual German soldier carried a Verbandpäckchen, a small field dressing, in the lower pocket of his tunic. It contained a sterile gauze pad and nothing more. It did not contain an antibiotic. It did not contain sulfur powder. It did not contain tablets. The German rifleman's job, when wounded, was to apply his gauze dressing and wait. Wait for the stretcher bearers, the Krankenträger, to carry him back. Wait for the Sanitätsunteroffizier to stabilize him. Wait for the medical officer at the Truppenverbandplatz to administer the sulfur his wound needed. The German soldier was, in his own system's logic, a patient. He was not a provider of care. The idea that he might treat himself with antibiotics, or treat the man in the foxhole next to him, was not part of the doctrine. It was not part of the training. It was not even part of the conversation. And here is the paradox that makes the rest of this story so strange. The German army was the army that had invented Auftragstaktik, mission-type tactics. It was the army that told its sergeants to seize villages on their own initiative, to change plans in the middle of battle without consulting headquarters, to act first and report afterward. The foundational military text of the Wehrmacht, the Truppenführung Manual of 1933, demanded that every commander from the highest to the lowest commit his full mental and physical strength to the task, and warned that inaction and neglect were greater sins than any error in the choice of means. A German sergeant in 1944 could be trusted with the lives of 30 men in a firefight. He could be trusted to read a tactical situation and make decisions that would determine whether his platoon lived or died. But he could not be trusted to sprinkle powder into a wound. That was a medical officer's job. The same army that gave its junior leaders extraordinary freedom in combat-reserved medical treatment as a credentialed hierarchical specialty. Initiative stopped at the boundary of the Sanitätsdienst, the medical service. A German sergeant could decide how to take a hill. He could not decide how to treat a cut. The line between those two decisions was drawn by a culture that believed expertise must be credentialed, and that a man without credentials had no business making expert decisions, even if the expert was 4 miles behind the front, and the man without credentials was holding his friend's intestines in with his hands. The Americans had no such boundary. And the reason they had no such boundary is the same reason that confused German officers across every front of the war. It was not a doctrine, it was a culture. In May of 1944, the Infantry Journal published a booklet called Combat First Aid, How to Save Life in Battle. It was written for the rifleman, not the medic. Its language was plain and direct. It told the soldier, Despite advances in medical care, you are responsible for your own life and the lives of those around you. Medical officers cannot be everywhere all the time, so you are the first line of defense. That sentence did not sound revolutionary to an American in 1944. It sounded obvious. Of course you are responsible for your own life. Of course you help the man next to you. Of course you do not wait for a specialist when a man is bleeding. You had been tying your own tourniquets since you cut yourself on the barbed wire fence on your family's farm in Kansas. You had been bandaging your brother's knee since he fell out of the tree in the backyard in Brooklyn. You had been the first responder at the automobile accident on the county road in Alabama because there was no ambulance within 30 miles, and somebody had to do something. The American soldier of 1944 was the product of a country that had spent 150 years telling its young men that waiting for an expert was not a plan, it was a surrender. Volunteer fire departments, where farmers and shopkeepers organized themselves without any professional training to fight fires that could destroy a town in an hour. Barn raisings, where 30 men who were not architects and not engineers built a structure in 2 days using nothing but hand tools and shared knowledge. Pick-up baseball games organized in empty lots with no umpire and no adult supervision. Farm boys who had been driving tractors, repairing fences, and operating threshing machinery since the age of 12. Automobile mechanic who had rebuilt Model T engines on kitchen tables with tools they improvised from whatever was in the shed. These were the men the Army drafted in 1941 and 1942. When the manual told them to sprinkle sulfur powder into a wound, it was not teaching them a new behavior. It was giving them permission to do what they had always done, which was to look at a problem and fix it with whatever was at hand. The sulfur packet was just another tool in the pocket of a man who had been solving problems without professional supervision his entire life. The German soldier had been raised in a different world. He had grown up in a culture that valued obedience to legitimate authority as a moral virtue, in a state that had spent the last decade systematically telling him that the Führer thought for the nation, that expertise belonged to the credentialed, that the correct response to a problem outside your specialty was to defer to the man whose specialty it was. His tactical training might tell him to take initiative on the battlefield, but every other signal in his life told him that initiative outside your designated area was dangerous and presumptuous. Medicine was the doctor's lane. A wound was the sanitator's responsibility. You carried your gauze. You waited for the system to reach you. And if the system did not reach you in time, that was the fortune of war. The first large-scale combat test of the American system came not in Europe but in the Pacific, on a Sunday morning that nobody in the United States military would ever forget. December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor. At 7:50 in the morning, the first wave of Japanese aircraft swept over the anchorage at Ford Island. Within minutes, Battleship Row was a wall of fire and smoke. The USS Arizona exploded. The USS Oklahoma capsized. Burning oil spread across the harbor water. Sailors were jumping from listing decks into water that was itself on fire. When the attack struck, the Naval Hospital at Pearl Harbor and Tripler Army Hospital were overwhelmed within hours. Operating rooms that had been set up for routine peacetime procedures were suddenly receiving hundreds of men with massive blast injuries, burns, shrapnel wounds, and compound fractures. The hospitals ran out of beds. They ran out of operating tables. They laid wounded men on the floor, in hallways, on the ground outside. Civilian surgeons from Honolulu rushed to the military hospitals to help, arriving by car, by taxi, by any transportation they could find. Among them was Dr. John Moorhead, a veteran army surgeon from the First World War who had been visiting the islands. He arrived at Tripler and began operating almost immediately after the attack commenced. At the Naval Hospital, military surgeons debrided compound fractures, removing dead tissue and debris from the wounds, and then sprinkled sulfanilamide powder directly into the open wounds before applying plaster casts. They marked the location of bone fragments on the outside of each cast in indelible pencil, so that later surgeons would know exactly where to look. This was one of the first documented large-scale uses of sulfur drugs in American combat medicine. Investigators Perrin Long and I.S. Ravdin, sent by the War Department to evaluate the medical response at Pearl Harbor, noted the effectiveness of aggressive debridement combined with sulfur application and commended the care that had been given under impossible conditions. Those findings reinforced the Army's decision, already underway, to make sulfur a standard issue item for every soldier in the field. But Pearl Harbor was a hospital event. The sulfur had been applied by surgeons in an operating room, not by riflemen in foxholes. It proved the drug worked. It did not yet prove the system worked. The first real test of the decentralized American model, every man his own first responder, came in North Africa. In February of 1943, at a Tunisian mountain pass called Kasserine, the American army met the Wehrmacht for the first time and was shattered. American forces lost approximately 300 killed, 3,000 wounded, and 3,000 captured in 5 days. More than 180 tanks were destroyed or abandoned. Nearly 7,000 replacements were needed to bring the battered units back to strength. Kasserine exposed every weakness in the young American military, from poor command decisions at the top to disorganized logistics at the bottom. German commanders looked at the wreckage and concluded what their intelligence analysts had been telling them. The Americans had factories but not fighters. They had equipment but not soldiers. But Kasserine also began a process of learning that accelerated faster than anyone, especially the Germans, expected. In the months after the defeat, American forces in North Africa were reorganized, retrained, and refitted. Medical logistics were overhauled. The aidman system was refined. Training in battlefield first aid was intensified at every level. And the sulfur packets that every soldier carried began to matter in a way the Army Medical Department had hoped for, but never fully tested until men started dying. The soldiers who had survived Kasserine told the soldiers who came after them that the powder worked. Sprinkle it in, swallow the tablets, keep fighting. The word spread not through official channels and not through army memoranda, but through the oldest communication system in any army, one soldier telling another soldier what had kept him alive. By the time American forces landed in Sicily in July of 1943 and pushed into mainland Italy that autumn, the medical system had been hardened by experience into something the pre-war planners had imagined but never tested at scale. The American aidman, the combat medic attached directly to infantry companies, had become one of the most important men in any rifle company. The system assigned roughly one aidman per rifle platoon. These men carried medical bags loaded with bandages, morphine syrettes, plasma, tourniquets, and sulfur, and they went wherever the infantry went. They wore Red Cross armbands and carried no offensive weapons, though both of those protections were honored inconsistently by both sides. The aidman was the bridge between the rifleman's Carlisle packet and the battalion aid station behind the lines. He was the man who reached you if your own sulfur and your buddy's bandage were not enough. By the Italian campaign, the relationship between the aidman and his platoon had become one of the defining bonds of the American infantry experience. The men trusted their medics with a ferocity that went beyond military protocol. They protected them. They carried extra supplies for them. And the aidman, in return, ran into fire to reach the wounded, with a regularity that produced a casualty rate among combat medics that was among the highest of any specialty in the Army. Meanwhile, the United States Army Medical Department trained over 43,000 surgical technicians in its enlisted technicians' schools during the war, building a pipeline of trained medical personnel that complemented the universal first aid training given to every soldier in basic. It was medical education at an industrial scale, the same American instinct for mass production that had turned 350,000 pounds of sulfur into 14 million, now applied to the production of men who could save lives. By June of 1944, when the Allied invasion of France began, the American medical system was operating at a level of decentralized efficiency that the German defenders had no framework to understand. On the morning of June 6, 1944, 2 young medics from the 2nd Battalion, 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division, parachuted into the darkness over the Cotentin Peninsula in Normandy. Their mission was part of the larger airborne operation designed to cut off German reinforcements from reaching the landing beaches. But paratroopers rarely land where they are supposed to land. The drop was scattered. Men came down in flooded fields, in hedgerows, and on rooftops. Many were miles from their intended drop zones. In the darkness and confusion, small groups found each other by clicking metal crickets and exchanging passwords, and then they moved toward whatever objective was closest. Among the scattered paratroopers that night were 2 medics whose names would become inseparable from a small Norman village. Their names were Robert Wright and Kenneth Moore. Wright was a medic from Columbus, Ohio. He had enlisted in the fall of 1942, volunteered for airborne service, and trained as a surgical technician. Moore was a private from Los Angeles County, California. He had been so angered by the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor that he volunteered for the paratroopers while still in high school. He had received only about 2 weeks of formal medical training. Within hours of touching French soil, Wright and Moore found each other in the chaos and darkness of the drop and made their way to a small 12th-century church in the hamlet of Angoville Plain, the Church of Saints Cosmas and Damian. Wright draped a Red Cross flag over the door. Moore arrived shortly after. They began treating the wounded. Over the next 3 days, as the village changed hands between American and German forces multiple times, Wright and Moore treated approximately 80 casualties. American paratroopers, German soldiers, French civilians, a local child. They made one rule: no weapons inside the church. Both sides honored it. When German troops retook the village, they entered the church, saw their own wounded being treated alongside Americans by 2 young men who were not doctors, who were not surgeons, who were paratroopers with Red Cross armbands and pockets full of sulfur and bandages, and they allowed them to continue working. The pews of that church were used as makeshift hospital beds. The bloodstains are still visible on the wood today. Stained glass windows were later installed in the church to honor Wright, Moore, and the 101st Airborne Division. Wright expressed his wish to be buried at the church. Bureaucratic complications made an official burial impossible, but some of his ashes were eventually smuggled into France and buried in the churchyard. His unofficial headstone reads simply R.E.W., his initials. Wright and Moore were medics. They were trained, however briefly, for the role they played. But the system that put them in that church, the system that trusted 2 young men with minimal medical training to set up an aid station in a combat zone and treat casualties from both sides without any supervision from a medical officer. There was the same system that put sulfur powder into every rifleman's pocket and told him to use it. It was the same assumption running at every level of the American military. The man on the ground knows what needs to be done. Let him do it. If your father or grandfather served in the Second World War, in any branch, in any theater, I would be honored to read their story in the comments. What unit did they serve with? Where were they stationed? What did they remember about the men around them? Those details, the small, specific, personal things, matter more than any official archive. They are the real history of what happened, and they deserve to be preserved by the families who carry them. In the Pacific, the American system faced a different enemy and a different environment, but the same principle held. Navy corpsmen serving with Marine units carried morphine, bandages, sulfanilamide packets, wire splints, scissors, and plasma. They tore the sulfur packets open and poured the powder directly over wounds under enemy fire. But it was not only the corpsmen doing this. Every Marine, every soldier, carried his own first aid packet with its own sulfur. In the jungles of Guadalcanal, where 8,000 men of the 1st Marine Division contracted malaria before they were relieved in December of 1942, sulfur guanidine, a variant of the sulfur family, was used to treat bacterial dysentery that was crippling entire units. Disease in the Pacific killed and incapacitated more men than enemy fire, and the drug gave American forces a measurable advantage in a theater where a case of dysentery could take a man out of the fight as effectively as a bullet. At the other end of the war, on the island of Okinawa, in the spring of 1945, the most extraordinary embodiment of the American medical ethos appeared in the person of a man who refused to carry a weapon. Private First Class Desmond Doss, Medical Detachment, 307th Infantry Regiment, 77th Infantry Division, was a Seventh-day Adventist from Lynchburg, Virginia. He was a conscientious objector who had enlisted in the army with the understanding that he would serve as a medic and would never be required to carry a rifle. His fellow soldiers mocked him during training. His officers tried to have him transferred out of the unit. Captain Jack Glover, his company commander, later admitted that he had wanted Doss gone. Doss endured it all and went into combat unarmed. On the Maeda Escarpment, a 400-foot cliff the soldiers called Hacksaw Ridge, Doss performed acts of courage that his own commanding officers later struggled to put into words. Between April 29 and May 21, 1945, as Japanese machine gun fire, mortar rounds and grenades tore through American positions on the escarpment, Doss refused to take cover. He crawled across open ground under fire to reach wounded men. He treated them where they lay, applying bandages, administering plasma, dragging them to the edge of the cliff. Then he lowered them one by one, using a rope and a special knot he had learned, down the face of the escarpment to waiting litter-bearers below. When his company was ordered to retreat on May 5 because Japanese fire had become overwhelming, Doss refused to leave. An estimated 75 wounded men were still on top of the ridge, unable to move under their own power. He stayed alone on the escarpment and lowered every one of them to safety. He worked through the night. His comrades later said that he would crawl among the wounded in the darkness, checking to see if they were alive. And if they were, he would drag them to the cliff edge and lower them down. On May 21, a Japanese grenade tore into his legs and hip. He treated his own wounds rather than call another aid man from cover. While being carried to safety on a litter, he saw another soldier more severely wounded than himself, crawled off the litter, and insisted the bearers take the other man first. A sniper's bullet then shattered his arm. He splintered it himself with a broken rifle stock and crawled 300 yards to an aid station. President Harry Truman placed the Medal of Honor around his neck on October 12, 1945. Doss was the first conscientious objector to receive the Medal of Honor in the Second World War. He had never fired a shot. He had never carried a weapon. He had done nothing but save lives. And when Captain Glover, the man who had wanted him out of the unit, was asked about Doss after the war, he said simply that Doss was one of the bravest persons alive and that having Doss end up saving his life was the irony of the whole thing. Doss was a trained medic. But the instinct that drove him, the refusal to wait for someone else to act, the insistence that he was personally responsible for the men around him regardless of what anyone said or ordered, was the same instinct the army had institutionalized when it put sulfur powder in every soldier's pocket. It was the same cultural assumption, scaled up to the level of almost incomprehensible courage. The most devastating test of the American medical system came in December of 1944 at Bastogne. When the German Ardennes offensive smashed through American lines on December 16, the 101st Airborne Division was rushed from reserve in France to defend the critical crossroads town. The 326th Airborne Medical Company, the division's only second-echelon medical unit, arrived at its destination after an all-night convoy on the morning of December 19. That same evening, barely 12 hours after setting up its tent hospital at a crossroads 8 miles northwest of Bastogne, Captain Willis McKee, one of the unit's surgeons and a veteran of both the Normandy and Market Garden campaigns, noticed crowds of panicked Belgian civilians streaming past the hospital. He drove to division headquarters to warn Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe that something was pushing those refugees toward Bastogne from the east. His warning came too late. At approximately 10:30 that night, an armoured column from the 116th Panzer Division's reconnaissance battalion overran the medical company's position. The Germans opened fire on the clearly marked Red Cross hospital tents. The firing lasted 15 minutes. When it stopped, 11 officers and 119 enlisted men of the 326th were prisoners of war. Private Henry Sullivan was killed. The 101st Airborne Division had just lost its only surgical facility, its medical officers, its surgical equipment, and the bulk of its medical supplies, 3 days into a battle that would last weeks. What happened next is a testament to the system the Americans had built. Inside the Bastogne perimeter, the remaining medical personnel, just 2 medical officers, 2 dental officers, 4 administrative officers, and roughly 113 enlisted men, set up aid stations in whatever buildings they could find, garages, cellars, bombed-out shops. They worked by candlelight when the generators failed. Plasma froze solid in the brutal cold. Morphine syrettes had to be warmed under a medic's armpit before the needles would penetrate frozen skin. Medical supplies dwindled to almost nothing. When the division's ammunition and supply situation became critical, cargo aircraft began making drops over the perimeter, and among the bundles floating down under parachutes were desperately needed medical supplies. Soldiers retrieved the containers under German artillery fire. Between December 19 and December 26, the medics and soldiers inside Bastogne treated 943 American casualties and 125 German prisoners with what they had. Trench foot, caused by prolonged exposure to cold and wet conditions, outpaced combat wounds as a source of casualties, and there was almost nothing the medics could do about it except tell men to change their socks, men who often had no dry socks to change into. On December 25, a surgeon named Major Howard Serrell was flown into the surrounded perimeter in a light observation aircraft. The following day, 4 more surgeons and 4 surgical assistants were flown in by glider: Major Laman Suter, Captain Stanley Wesolowski, Captain Foy Moody, and Captain Henry Hills, all from the Third Army. 5 doctors, inserted into a surrounded town under fire by aircraft and gliders, to replace an entire medical company that had been captured 6 days earlier. It was improvisation at an institutional scale. And it worked, because the principle at the bottom of the system, every man responsible for the man next to him, did not require a fully staffed hospital to operate. The privates pulling wounded soldiers through the snow and tearing open their own Carlisle packets to treat injuries they had no formal medical training to address were the system. The system was not the building. It was not the surgeon. It was the man with the packet. There is a document that brings the two medical systems into direct comparison with a clarity that no post-war memoir can match. The 1945 5th United States Army Surgeons Report, produced by American medical observers who had spent months studying both the Allied and German medical services in the Mediterranean and European theatres, laid the two systems side by side with clinical precision. The report documented the German chain of evacuation, the Verwundetennest, the Truppenverbandplatz, the Hauptverbandplatz, echelon by echelon, and placed American medical practices alongside them for comparison. In the German system, wound antisepsis with sulfur drugs was performed at the second echelon, under the supervision of a medical officer. In the American system, it was performed at the 0 echelon, by the wounded soldier himself, in the first seconds after being hit, with a packet he carried in his own pocket. The report noted that visiting German wounded offered a contrast by which to bring into better view what had actually been accomplished in the American medical service. The observers documented that German prisoners of war who received American medical care were repeatedly surprised by the treatment they received. American medics treated captured enemy wounded under the Geneva Convention, providing them with sulfur tablets and, when supplies were limited, prioritizing penicillin for American forces while giving German prisoners sulfadiazine for their wounds. The German prisoners, many of whom had been trained in a system where medical care flowed through a chain of specialists, found themselves being treated by American enlisted men, by aidmen and medics, and even by infantry soldiers, who tore open their own Carlisle packets to treat a wounded enemy, because that was what the situation required, and nobody had told them not to. The observers were not boasting. They were documenting a structural difference in how two armies conceived of the relationship between the individual soldier and the medical system that was supposed to keep him alive. The German system asked, "How we get the wounded man to the medicine?" The American system asked, "How we get the medicine to the wounded man?" The German answer was evacuation. The American answer was the Carlisle packet. The numbers tell part of the story, though they must be read with honest caveats that anyone claiming to tell this history accurately is obligated to include. In the First World War, approximately 8% of battle casualties who reached medical installations died of their wounds. In the Second World War, that figure dropped to roughly 4%. In the European theatre specifically, the rate was approximately 3.2%. The Third Army After Action report claimed 2.78%. The decline was real, and it was dramatic, and it saved tens of thousands of lives. But the causes were multiple, and no honest accounting can assign the improvement to any single factor. Sulfur drugs played a role. So did penicillin, which began reaching frontline medical units in significant quantities by mid-1944, manufactured in massive quantities at facilities like Pfizer's converted ice plant on Marcy Avenue in Brooklyn, which opened in March of 1944, and produced most of the penicillin that went ashore with Allied forces on D-Day. So did vastly improved surgical techniques, faster evacuation by jeep ambulance, and later by air, the widespread use of blood plasma, and better sanitation and preventive medicine. No serious historian attributes the survival rate improvement to sulfur drugs alone. Colonel Elliot Cutler, the chief surgical consultant for the European Theatre of Operations, wrote in May of 1943, after extensive observation in North Africa, that even under optimal conditions, sulfur drugs did not keep infection away from wounds. He could not say with confidence that they had saved lives based on clinical evidence. And yet, he noted, almost to a man, the soldiers said when questioned that their lives had been saved by the use of sulfur drugs. There is something profoundly important in that gap between the surgeon's clinical uncertainty and the soldier's absolute conviction. The soldier believed in the powder because the powder was his. It was in his pocket. He controlled it. He did not have to wait for anyone's permission to use it. In a world where everything else was chaos, where artillery could kill you and the medic might not reach you and the stretcher-bearers might be dead, the packet of sulfur was the one thing a man could do for himself. The act of sprinkling that powder into a wound was an act of agency. It was a man telling himself that he was not helpless, that the situation was not yet beyond his control. Whether the powder itself saved his life, or whether the belief that he could save himself gave him the will to keep fighting until the medics arrived, is a question that medicine cannot fully answer even today. But either way, the powder mattered, not as a miracle drug, as a symbol of trust. And here is the twist that completes this story and makes it more complicated than either side wanted to admit. The Americans stopped using it. By the end of July 1944, the first United States Army surgeon recommended abandoning the practice of sprinkling sulfanilamide powder into open wounds. The reasons were clinical, and they were damning. The powder, combined with the oral tablets, produced excessive doses that could harm the kidneys. The crystalline powder made wounds dirtier rather than cleaner, without reaching the deepest tissue where bacteria were actually multiplying. The powder could act as a foreign body, like a splinter, that actually hindered healing rather than promoting it. Orders to cease using sulfur powder on wounds came through in January and February of 1945, as penicillin became available in sufficient quantities to replace it. The iconic image of the American soldier sprinkling white powder into a bleeding wound, an image that became one of the defining visual memories of the war, is accurate for the period from roughly 1941 to 1944. By the war's end, the practice was being phased out. The drug that had symbolized American self-reliance on the battlefield had quietly failed its own clinical test. But here is the thing the Germans never understood, and the thing that outlasted the drug itself. The powder was never the point. The point was the principle. The principle was that every soldier is responsible for his own first aid and for the first aid of the man beside him. The principle was that you do not wait for a specialist when a life is at stake. The principle was that the man closest to the problem is the man best positioned to solve it, and the job of the system is to give that man the tools and the training and the trust to act. That principle did not die when the sulfur shaker envelope was removed from the Carlisle packet. It lived on. It lives today. The modern American military's improved first aid kit, the IFAK, is a direct descendant of the Carlisle packet. Every American soldier in combat today carries a tourniquet, hemostatic gauze, a chest seal, a nasopharyngeal airway, and other life-saving equipment on his or her body armor. The Combat Lifesaver program trains non-medical soldiers to perform advanced first aid, including intravenous fluid administration that goes far beyond anything a Second World War rifleman was asked to do. The idea is the same idea. You are the first line of defense. You do not wait. Gerhard Domagk died in 1964 in Bergburg, Germany. He had received his Nobel diploma and medal in 1947, 8 years after the prize was awarded. He spent his later years researching treatments for tuberculosis and cancer. His discovery of Prontosil had opened the door to the entire family of sulfonamide antibiotics and, indirectly, to the age of antibiotics itself. He never saw the inside of an American foxhole. He never watched an American sergeant tear open a Carlisle packet and sprinkle crystalline sulfanilamide into a bullet wound on a frozen hillside in Belgium. But the chain from his laboratory bench in Elberfeld to that frozen hillside is direct and unbroken. Robert Wright and Kenneth Moore, the two medics who turned a 12th century church into an aid station on D-Day and treated 80 casualties from both sides without a single order from a superior officer, both survived the war. They returned to Angoville-au-Plain in later years and were welcomed as heroes by the village. Both earned the Silver Star. A memorial plaque outside the church reads, "In honor and in recognition of Robert E. Wright and Kenneth J. Moore, Medics 2nd Battalion, 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division, for humane and life-saving care, rendered to 80 combatants and a child in this church in June 1944. Desmond Doss came home from Okinawa with the Medal of Honor, a shattered arm, and tuberculosis he had contracted in the Pacific. He spent years recovering. He settled in Piedmont, Alabama, and lived quietly until his death on March 23, 2006, at the age of 87. He is buried at the Chattanooga National Cemetery in Tennessee. He never carried a weapon in his life. Captain Willis McKee, the surgeon who drove to warn McAuliffe the night the 326th was overrun, spent the rest of the war as a prisoner. Private Henry Sullivan, the medic killed in the attack on the hospital tents, never came home. In the official records, he is listed as killed in action on December 19, 1944, near Bastogne, Belgium. His death is recorded as the single fatality alongside 130 men taken prisoner, a footnote in the larger story of the Bulge. But Sullivan was a medic. He had volunteered to save lives. And he died in a hospital tent with a red cross on it, not because the enemy had mistaken it for a military target, but because the distinction did not matter in the dark. His story does not fit neatly into the narrative of either army. He is not a symbol, he is a name. The German medical system was not incompetent. This must be said plainly because the temptation in telling a story like this is to flatten one side into a villain and the other into a hero, and that would be dishonest. The German medical system was professional, rigorous, and in many categories technically excellent. Its surgeons were among the best trained in Europe. Its evacuation chain was carefully designed, and, when it functioned as intended, highly effective. Its doctrine was internally coherent. German military medicine saved enormous numbers of German lives over the course of the war. What it could not do was trust the man at the bottom. It could not bring itself to believe that the rifleman, the ordinary lancer in the foxhole, could be given a medical tool and trusted to use it correctly without a doctor standing over him. The American system had no such hesitation, not because the Americans had studied the problem more carefully, but because the Americans had grown up in a country where the man at the bottom had been fixing his own problems since before he could shave. The question that runs through this entire story is not really about sulfur powder. It is about what a country believes its ordinary citizens are capable of. Germany built one of the finest military medical services in the world and placed it in the hands of trained specialists. America built a simpler one and placed it in the hands of everyone. The German approach was logical, the American approach was messy, and in the end, the messy approach saved more lives, not because the drug was better, but because the man who needed it already had it in his pocket, and he did not need to ask anyone for permission to use it. That was not a decision made by a general or a surgeon or a committee. It was a reflection of a country that had always assumed its people could figure things out on their own. And that assumption, carried across an ocean in a wax-coated packet no larger than a deck of cards, turned out to be the most powerful piece of medical equipment either army ever fielded. If this investigation gave you something to think about, hit that subscribe button. There are more of these stories. Most of them are about ordinary men in ordinary uniforms who looked at the problem in front of them and decided that they did not need permission to solve it, not because anyone had told them they were special, but because nobody had ever told them they were not.